Yo, what's up? Trīp Tøur, Trīp Tøur, Trīp Tøur, Trīp Tøur. Get your Rari, get all the girls. We going to the Trīp Tøur, Trīp Tøur, Trīp Tøur, Trīp Tøur. Yo, did you hear what I said? Trīp Tøur, hey, Trīp Tøur, yo, Trīp Tøur, yo, Trīp Tøur. What's up, Trīp Tøur? Yo, you hear what I said? We going on a trip. That's why it's called Trīp Tøur. We going a tour on a trip. That's why it's called Trīp Tøur. Get your Rari, get your Lamborghini, get your Ferrari. Get everything you know for the car. We going in a Trīp Tøur. Trīp Tøur, Trīp Tøur, Trīp Tøur. You're an athlete, you're invited. Come on, we going on a trip. Don't worry about it, it's just a trip. Trīp Tøur, we going tour on a trip. Search on the map. You know I'm cool because we in a Trīp Tøur, Trīp Tøur, Trip Tøur, Trīp Tøur. Relax, calm down. It's just a tour to go on a trip. That's why it's called a Trīp Tøur. Cause we go on a tour, we tour on a trip. We just get all your stuff. We going on a Trīp Tøur. We tour all the trips. Come on, don't be scared. We going on a Trīp Tøur cause we cool. We an athlete, we exotic. Come on, we going on a Trīp Tøur. We tour a trip. Trīp Tøur, don't forget that. I know how to say, if you don't come to the Trīp Tøur, you're not an athlete. Chill down, it's a Trīp Tøur, don't be scared. Don't be such a loser. Come on, go in the Trīp Tøur now. It's because it's a Trīp Tøur, Trīp Tøur. Hello, come on, you're invited, come on. Trīp Tøur. It's just a trip. It's an 8-hour trip. You can tour all around, take pictures, come on. It's just an 8-hour tour. If you say no, what is going on your brain? It's a Trīp Tøur.